Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, finally, we're going to be talking about the new album from Liars, titled Mess. And now we're coming to the part of the year where I talk about artists and albums that I might have otherwise missed throughout the course of the year and just never really got a chance to really dig into and discuss. Now, the biggest reason why these reviews tend to be as late as they are, it's pretty simple. They've either just slipped the net, they've fallen off my schedule by accident, or have such lengthy, complicated discographies that it makes talking about them at length a real endeavor, or at least requires more time for me to really dig into those discographies so I get the historical context. And that's before we get to a band like Liars, an LA experimental rock band that has only two consistent elements: a dark, menacing, groove-driven sound, and the fact that they're going to keep evolving and pushing said sound in weird directions. They're a band that's infamous for making left turns, and thus expecting any sort of consistency from them was pretty much doomed the second they dropped They Were Wrong, So We Drowned and alienated a massive chunk of their fan base. From there, they got noisier, darker, and heavier with their krautrock-inspired Drums Not Dead, the more spacious and brutish self-titled album, or the warped, more gothic side of Sister World, which I really liked. And then they followed it with Wish You in 2012, which I didn't really love. Their choice to go for more stiff, brittle, electronic-inspired rhythms just wasn't to my taste. And while it is a more subtle record, the songwriting didn't really grip me all that much either. It was also a record that eschewed some of the darkness of their earlier work, which for me was a slight misstep. I mean, I like Liars when they get surreal and creepy and ominous, and while there was some of that brand of feeling coming from Wish You, it was very much muted, and that was a lot to the album's detriment. In other words, it didn't really click with me. So when I heard about Mess, I was intrigued about it, not just by the critical acclaim, really some of the mixed critical reactions to this record, but by the fact that the recording was apparently very different to Wish You, a lot more confident and strident with a more electronic direction. And given that Liars can make some genuinely thrilling music, I was definitely interested here. So I finally got around to checking this out. What do we get here? Well, honestly, a record that didn't really grip me as much as I wanted it to. Liars continued their steps towards tightly syncopated rhythms and electronic rock with Mess, and with every step that they've taken, it's just gotten less and less interesting for me. Well, it's because I can still so plainly trace the styles that they're emulating to their original sources, and I'm seeing less and less of their original personality, which I liked. The odd thing about this record is that I get the impression that was part of the band's intention. It's a mess with a purpose, an album intentionally designed to be a massive middle finger to those who would start slapping down labels and critics leveling unfair expectations, which places me in a distinctly awkward position because on some level, I completely respect what Liars is doing as a band. I just wish I liked this album more. It's better than Wish You, but not by much. So I think the best place to start with Mess would probably be in the lyrics, and I've always liked Liars' brand of songwriting. Let me state that right up front, and frankly, they seem to be getting better with every release. There's a certain snide, uncouth bluntness to the writing that I've always liked, always willing to paint themselves and everything else around them very honestly, without mincing any words. And considering the lyrical standards for most songs in this genre, Liars is definitely a step above. What I really like about their brand of lacerating commentary is how their nihilism shows off both sides, conforming to the critical expectations and losing one's artistic soul, or doing whatever you want, castigating a conformist world around you, and acknowledging how liberating that might be while being starkly ugly in contrast to everybody else. And I definitely appreciated how Liars tackled every side of this angle. Massmaker sees them shred illusions that people place around themselves, and I'm No Gold and Can't Hear Well shows them acknowledging their own flaws while reasserting their own artistic identity. And then you got the more outward attacking tracks, those who criticize their creative process and choices on Vox Tune Dead, executives that would dictate to them or seek to control them on my favorite track of the album, Pro Anti-Anti, or the increasingly frustrated consumers who might judge them on Mess on a Mission, or their closing statement on Less Speaker Blown, where they state the only thing that would mend their imperfections, if they could be mended, was time. And that imperfection makes for drama and art. It's what makes us human. And those who would enforce arbitrary standards of perfection would be better off never making music. You know what? I can buy that. And Liars made sure to show just what would happen if they did conform or allow themselves to be paralyzed by indecision on the eerie song Boyzone, or the excellent track Dresswalker, which features one of the most telling lines on the entire album. It gets simple when you tire, but where does simple fit with life? Striving to make it all fit into very rigid, perfect form sucks the light out of life. And while that light might be unkempt, eerie, and brutal, it's far preferable in the end because at least it's human. Now let me stress this. Lyrically, this is killer stuff. Material I find incredibly compelling, and if it was paired with electronic rock that had more heft and grime, or was willing to go in darker, more twisted experimental directions, I'd probably be praising this album to the high heavens. I'd probably love it. But that doesn't exactly happen. Instead, following as a continuation to Wish You in terms of syncopated, tightly regimented rhythms that always feel a little bit too underweight to really match the darkness and more aggressive content in some of the lyrics. I don't typically like pitch-shifted vocals as it is, but you know what? They do set the right tone on Mask Maker to open up the album, but it's a shame that that's the only thing about that track that really clicks with me about that song with the choppy vocals and the tech house beat. Can't Hear Well goes for a similar minimalist presentation with only a single sawing synth melody with only minor variations, no real beat behind the track, and while there is a certain elegance to the synth tone, there's just so little to the song in terms of production, so it doesn't really stick with me. The single instrumental Dark Slide takes a gurgling beat progression and pairs it with some rattling percussion and a couple glitchy synth lines that eventually tries to bring in some spacier effects, but without much of a real melody behind it, once again, it doesn't really stick. That lack of really interesting melodies does hurt this album a lot for me, because as so many of the grooves feel lacking in crunch and real presence in the mix, I find myself grasping for melodic progressions that aren't really there or aren't really all that complex or interesting. Now, there are a few places that get a lot closer. I dug the heavy synth groove on Vox Tune Dead. The bleak I'm No Gold took a bit to get going, but you know what, with the distorted vocals, the thicker mix, and the eventual organ interlude kicked the gothic atmosphere into gear, and I really liked it then. Pro Anti-Anti features this borderline industrial riff with a thick, eerie synth progression with clattering percussion that worked really well. Mess on a Mission took its real chip tune feel into a surprisingly snappy track that features one of the better crescendos over the chorus, and Dresswalker takes a very robotic groove and probably one of Liar's most conventional mainstream accessible tracks and turns into a pretty slick dance number that I could see myself liking. Hell, I liked most of the atmosphere they built on the final two tracks too. There's a lot to like here about the instrumentation on this album, but you know what? Now it's time to get to the elephant in the room, and that is that it's very hard for me to listen through this album and not see direct links to the more synth-heavy tracks from bands like Depeche Mode, or The Cure, or Bauhaus, or Sister of Mercy, or a lot of the later dark wave scene. And to be fair, that's not a bad thing. I get the feeling that Liars knows exactly what they're doing stepping towards that sound, and it's a good fit for them. And it's not a great fit. I'm struggling to pin down why. Maybe it's the lack of a serious chugging bass line beyond some thicker beats and some real snarl in the lower end, or maybe Argus Andrews' vocals that have always sounded a lot better in his authoritative mid to low range over his falsetto, which he uses way too much on this album. Or maybe it's the fact that some of the songs feel a little bit long for some of the ideas that they're trying to present, especially on the back half, with the mix never really feeling spacious enough, instead of giving a record that feels very dense but kind of bare bones at points. And having listened to some genuinely great experimental electronic music throughout the course of this year thus far, courtesy of Object or Arca or Flying Lotus, maybe I'm just a little bit disappointed that Liars didn't quite stick the landing for me. They could have done something more experimental here, going in that dark wave direction, and I don't really think they got all the way there. So you know what? In the end, while Mess by Liars does get better every single time I listen to it, and the lyrics really do save this album, they do, I'm still kind of conflicted on how I would judge it. By the standards of Darkwave, no, by the standards of Liars' other material, it succeeds lyrically while underwhelming me instrumentally, which leaves me feeling that while this record is still very good, it's just probably not for me. So with that, I'm thinking a light 7 out of 10 and a recommendation. It's not my favorite Liars record by a long shot, but if you're interested in some intelligent, dark-edged electronic rock, you know what? You could definitely do a lot worse. So go on, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, we're coming up on the end of the year. It's going to be a very tight schedule, so depending whether or not Lil Wayne decides to delay his album again, I might have very few openings. So if you guys got any suggestions that I should cover before the end of the year, leave them down in the comments. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm also all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.